The resolution being debated this evening is Atheism Poisons Everything. Arguing the affirmative of the resolution is Dr. David Berlinski, a scientist, professor of mathematics, and author of many books, most notably The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. Arguing the negative of the resolution is Christopher Hitchens, journalist, cultural critic, and best-selling author. And most recently, he is the author of the memoir, Hitch 22. We will now begin our debate. And Dr. David Berlinski, please open for us.
Thank you all very much for being here. I would like to thank Larry Taunton and the Fixed Point Foundation for their outstanding hospitality. And to Christopher Hitchens, Landsman, my pleasure at being allowed to bask in the radiance of his reputation, and l'chaim. The proposition before us is atheism poisons everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm perfectly aware, and you should be too, that that proposition is fully compatible with the proposition that religion poisons something. Were Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins tomorrow to announce that they were prepared to invade hell in order to roust a variety of pederastic priests, I would wish them well, although for reasons of personal inconvenience, I could not join them. In some respects, as Dr. Johnson once said, the proposition that atheism poisons everything hardly requires a defense. The inquiry is not needed, he said. The last date at which atheism was a possibility in social thought was also the last date in which it was a plausibility in social thought. I ask you to cast your mind back, around 1790, 1791 in France, Paris, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And standing there, somewhat elaborated by my historical imagination, is Robespierre, reed, thin, narrow, green-eyed, fanatical, rabid as a bat, and Danton, large, boisterous, remarkably eloquent. And they're watching, or they're looking at Notre Dame, and one guy says to the other, "What should we do with this pile of Gothic junk?" And the answer is, let's rename it. Good idea. What should we call it? Each man was hoping they would call it after themselves, but that was not to be. And Robespierre came up with a wonderful idea. We'll call it the Temple of Reason. Good thinking, his companion said. The Temple of Reason, that works splendidly. It means nothing, but it works splendidly. We might as well have called it the Temple of Evidence, Temple of Rationality. What should we do next, was the question. And the inevitable answer, the answer known from historical circumstances, well, let's go out and kill a whole lot of people. And that's exactly what they did. Once they had renamed Notre Dame the Temple of Reason, it was relatively easy to go out and kill 50,000 innocent men, women, and children. That, I submit to you, is the nature of the proposition we are discussing. 1851, 60 or 70 years later, an age of remarkable progress, enlightenment, wonderful sense of dawning material possibility. Matthew Arnold, in a poem entitled Dover Beach, reflected on the decline of religious faith in Europe, the melancholy, long withdrawing raw. He didn't see anything particularly optimistic in that withdrawal. And he could think to say to himself and to his readers only this, "Ah, my beloved, let us be true to one another. My beloved, true to one another. For the world which lies about us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath neither really joy, nor light, nor love, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain, and we are caught as on a darkling plain, swept by confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." This is a prophetic declaration from the heart of the progressive, enlightened 19th century. In 1914, surveying the carnage that was to come, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain said, again prophetically, the lights are going out all over Europe. The lights, what a strange word. We shall not see them lit again in our time. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the 20th century was a record in Germany, in Russia, in China, in Cambodia, and elsewhere, not only of remarkable stupidity, brutality, and violence, but of unparalleled brutality, stupidity, and violence. And each of the regimes behind this remarkable decay of civilization had two features in common, two characteristics we should bear in mind. In the first place, the men guiding these regimes and their entourage did not believe for a moment there was any power higher than their own. And they acted on that assumption. And in the second place, in the mass murders they conducted, they were aided and supported by any number of crackpot scientific disciplines. That makes for a characteristic combination. In the case of the Nazis, the scientific disciplines were derived from biology, and especially from Darwinian biology. In 1937, having murdered 70,000 handicapped men, women, and children, the Nazis released a film, and on the background of the film, the narrator says in terms of solemn incomprehension, "My goodness, we have sinned against the law of natural selection." The law of natural selection. What could that mean? We have sinned against the law of natural selection. The communists, of course, had an equally crackpot theory that they derived from Marxian economics, the two crackpotteries joining in one deeply repugnant stream. As all of you know, atheism today is not simply the private doctrine of a handful of individuals. It's become a social movement. And as a social movement, it has been advanced chiefly by the scientific community, certainly in the United States, but to a large extent in Europe too. Some of this is adventitious. A few popular writers, such as Richard Dawkins, discovered that by writing books indicating that science has shown that God does not exist, well, they could make a fortune. I'm very sorry I wasn't there to join them. I didn't think of it at the time. I'm quite sure that someone now is writing a book, How Margarine Science Shows That God Does Not Exist. But the inevitable consequences of this degree of atheism within the scientific community has involved a deformation of scientific thought, quite striking in its character and its extent. After all, the sciences, if we restrict our attention to the serious sciences, and those may be found in mathematics or in mathematical physics in no other place, then we must recognize that the serious sciences have nothing to say about the existence of God, either in their premises or in their conclusion. What a remarkable fact. People are writing books how physics shows that God does not exist, but physics has nothing to say about the existence of God. The aching questions that trouble the human imagination, about which the sciences, when seriously considered, are resolutely silent, these remain just where they were. And the religious tradition, especially the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, has offered a coherent body of belief and doctrine by which they can be explained. Do we understand why the universe arose 14 million? No, we don't. Do we understand why it's there at all? No, we have no idea. Do we understand how life emerged on Earth? Not a prayer right now. Do we understand the complexity of life? We can't even begin to describe a living creature in anything resembling precise terms. Recent article in Science Digest, cell division requires 4,000 coordinated proteins acting together. What a remarkable statement. What a wealth of information we possess about biology. What an abundant lack of understanding we have about living systems. Do we understand why the laws of nature are true? No, we have no idea. Do we understand the miracle of analytic continuation in physics when certain kinds of functions can be pushed forward into the future contrary to all experience? Do we understand why the universe remains stable from moment to moment? The medievals pondered this question, ladies and gentlemen, and they came to the conclusion, and I quote a medieval theologian, that God is everywhere conserving the world. What a remarkable declaration. Can we do without it? Can we do without it? Do we have an explanation for the continuity and stability of the universe? There is one paper that I know in the literature by Freeman Dyson that addresses the stability of matter. But beyond that, everything is enigmatic. How can we propose seriously and solemnly to rule out of court in advance a hypothesis that not only answers to the human heart in many respects, but that answers to genuine intellectual needs in other respects? When one sees the American scientific community like a herd of wildebeests trotting across a fruited plain, it's very reasonable to ask, are they going someplace or are they fleeing from someplace? And I think the overwhelmingly obvious answer is they are fleeing. They're fleeing from an idea that they reject for a variety of reasons. Not only is the inquiry about atheism not necessary in terms of the history of social thought, it's not necessary in terms of the outlines of scientific thought, but there is a last question to be addressed, perhaps the most important for you and me. The cosmologist Joel Primack asked an interesting question. He asked, what compels the electron to follow the laws of nature? Good question, I don't know. But Heinrich Himmler, who had presided over the destruction of churches and synagogues throughout Europe and was the mastermind behind the extermination of the Jewish people, asked a very similar question in 1944. When confronted with the onerous treaty obligations the German state had adopted with respect to its own satraps, he asked insouciantly but pregnantly, after all, what compels us to keep our promises? Moral relativism is very often derided as an unhappy consequence of atheism. I don't think moral relativism is a particularly deep issue, but I do think the issue of what compels us to keep our promises is very relevant. I have in front of me rather a remarkable button. If you should press it, yours would be untold riches and whatever else you desire. The only consequence to pressing it beyond your happiness is the death of an anonymous Chinese peasant. Who among us would you trust with this button? Sit still, Christopher. Thank you.
Christopher Hitchens.
Can you give me 3 minutes, not 30 seconds? Can you give me 3 minutes, not 30 seconds? Thank you, Professor Berlinski. Thank you, Larry, for the very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. At short notice, I can only hope to match the Parisian urbanity of my rival in knowledge of French ecclesiastical architecture and its cosmic implications, and in the ready access to modern 20th century poetry. Well, let's take, instead of Notre Dame and the famous story of its deconsecration by Danton and Robespierre, the erection of the other most prominent église of Paris, the one that you see on your way in from the airport, the grand wedding cake style erection of Sacré-Cœur, the Sacred Heart, built on top of the commanding heights of Montmartre. Built why? Built to celebrate the massacre of Parisian workers and intellectuals after the Paris Commune of 1871 had tried to save the honor of a humiliated France that had thrown itself officially and was thrashing at the feet of Bismarck and his Prussian invaders. Many, many more people were killed in that massacre, in that terrible reprisal, than were killed in the whole of the terror. And it wasn't enough that that was the case, but a whole church had to be consecrated by the French religious and clerical establishment and their political allies to celebrate the massacre of their fellow countrymen. Does this prove that religion poisons everything? By no means does it do so. Does it help to curtain raise and to understand the terrible century which Professor Berlinski and I have both studied? Yes, to a degree it does. This French right wing, clerical right wing, goes on to the terrible arraignment and frame up of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, possibly the most serious miscarriage of justice in most thoroughgoingly justified and advanced by a political establishment in modern European history. This and the sides taken in it determine who will be who in the terrible War of 1914, which Dermot McCullough, admired by Larry Taunton among others as a historian of Christianity and very much venerated by me in his magnificent history, new history of the first 2,000 years of Christianity, describes as a theocratic war. He says the Christendom, as we used to understand it, as our fathers and grandfathers used to understand it, ends in 1914 when every country in Europe goes to war in the name of its own God or church. King George VI is the king, emperor, and the head of the Church of England. The Tsar of Russia is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is considered not to be a god, but a little more than a human being. You know the rest of it. It's the first time that Gott mit uns is put on the belt buckles, but not the last time, of the German army. And this is the end of Christendom and the curtain raiser to fascism. Without that terrible war of Christendom, it's impossible that the totalitarian movements that became such a threat to civilization could have arisen in the first place. And just to stay with France, it is the Vichy collaborationist regime, the rounder-up of France's Jews, the massacre agent in the French colonies, the collaborator with the Third Reich, that strikes from the French coinage the noble words liberty, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and replaces them with the Catholic slogan, famille, patrie, travail. And under this, France fell to the lowest point of its history. So I would beware, sir, of deriving your argument about atheism from the coincidences of French ecclesiastical design. But I'm with you on the larger point that you made, and I'll also try and illustrate it from the work actually of a great Anglo-Catholic, Anglo-American poet, Thomas Stearns Eliot, who in his choruses from the Rock asks the question, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? This is a question that has to preoccupy us all. When I am told, and I suppose in one way you could accuse me of taking it on faith, because I couldn't prove it for myself, and having had it demonstrated to me, I probably couldn't repeat the demonstration. But having been told by Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss and all of the leaders in the field of physics that we now estimate a total of 400 billion galaxies, that's not universes or solar systems, 400 billion galaxies, and asked to decide the question, with one sun every second since the Big Bang, or one star, we only call our own star the sun in an apotropaic, propitiating way that comes from our terrorized ancestors. A star that size goes out every second. So that's quite a lot while I'm talking. And has been blowing up and going out ever since the first moment of the Big Bang. This is more than we can handle. We cannot say we know about this. It can be argued that all that was indeed set in motion with the intention of producing, on a very small planet, in a very small solar system, in a tiny neglected suburb of a relatively unimportant galaxy, a race of beings, primate, but capable of language and reason, who believe that if they make the right propitiations, they will live forever. You could say that all that gigantic explosion and destruction was designed with that in mind. But I wouldn't be able to take your word for it. And it seems to me that the burden is not on me. I don't have to prove that kind of thing. I don't make the equivalent claim that the religious person has to make. The religious person doesn't have to just say, of course God wanted it that way and that's the way it is. because a design of that kind doesn't just imply a designer, it implicates a designer. It means, if there is such a designer, he's fantastically destructive and wasteful, as he is in microcosm. 99.8% of all species ever on this earth have already become extinct. This is a pitiless, wasteful, capricious designer. I can't prove that that isn't the way he wanted it to be, but I can say that there's an implication for the designer. But again, it's not me who's saying that if you believe in it, you have the means of grace and the hope of glory and the possibility of redemption and vicarious salvation and forgiveness of sins through human sacrifice and eternal life. We can't attempt and don't try anything like that. So the agnostic or the deist is not arbitrating between equal kinds of certainty. Those who are certain in the face of all this uncertainty and unknowability, the strongest ground of agreement between me and David, are bound to say, if they're arbitrating it properly, the first people to leave the island are the ones who say they already know enough, that they know why this is happening, that they know the mind of God. Those who claim the certainty are out of the argument. The argument then goes on between deists, agnostics, and atheists. How can we make sense of what we know, and how can we, in doing so, be true to the great principle adumbrated by Socrates, which is this: you must educate yourself by striving constantly, excuse me, as hard as you can to get to the point of understanding your own ignorance. Only then can you claim to have any acquaintance with knowledge at all. That's the appropriate and due modesty that the founder of our school of thought brought to the question. And there's no proof that Socrates ever existed. I tend to think, from the eyewitness accounts and second-hand ones, that he did. It would be quite hard to confect such a personality, but it doesn't matter to me whether he existed or not. We have the method. He taught us how to think. If I was to tell Larry, after our drive down through Shenandoah yesterday and our joint reading of the first passages of the Gospel of St. John, that the Jesus who is so real to him is in fact, or could be proved to be, only a fictitious person, a mythical individual, it would have to ruin Comrade Taunton's day. Not just his day, his life. It would extinguish his hope. Is there not something slightly fanatical in placing such large claims, remember the size of the claims I'm talking about,
3 minutes,
on such a slender and narrow basis? Now we'll get to the Nazis in my rebuttal, if that's all right. That won't take frightfully long, and to the totalitarians. And we'll have to do, can we be moral without believing fantastic things? That won't take too long either. And we can do a number of other things too that I have so far left unaddressed, but believe me, not forgotten. But I just wanted to see if I could introduce, just for once, a new element into this argument. You must, when you next go to Washington, go to the newest museum in the United States. It's the newly opened Hall of Human Origins in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. It's, by the way, paid for by Mr. Koch, the former Libertarian candidate for president and founder and paymaster of the Tea Party movement. So I invite you to join me once again in saying, in some way, this really is a great country. Here is the greatest gallery giving the proper account of evolution and our true origins that has ever been erected in any country. The bit that has fascinated me and taken me back to it again and again is this. Until 17,000 years ago only in one case, and not many more years than that in others, there were at least 3 other hominid or human species. Primates like us with large brain pans, language capacity, in the case of the Neanderthals very significantly, decorated graves, which suggests, if it doesn't insist upon the idea of a ritual and a religion. They have genes in common with us. They are of our species. And they've left important traces. They weren't very well understood, or in some cases known at all, the case of the Flores Islanders of the Indonesian archipelago, only until very recently. But there they always were. They were our brothers and our sisters and our kin, and they had all these yearnings and hopes and terrors and fears. And they're not in Genesis. and they've had no one to visit their graves or do them honor until very recently, and as a result of scientific innovation and curiosity. And whatever gods they had abandoned them. And so I just think it's worth brooding, since we talk about ourselves as the objects of a tremendous cosmic and biological process that was set in motion, supervised, and if it's to be believed, designed, intended. I just think we should take a moment of silence and think of our fellow humans, our fellow creatures, the fellow extinct, already extinct members of our species, to whom we might spare a little thought before we go on. I'm in your debt, and I'll be back. Thanks.
We now move to rebuttals. 6 minutes, Dr. Belinsky.
Thank you very much. There's a disturbing area of agreement that I sense between Mr. Hitchens and myself, which I will do my best to minimize. Please remember, ladies and gentlemen, that when it comes to the wickedness of religion, I have ceded the point. It's no longer argumentative. I would remind you, however, of a remark Dr. Johnson made. He made it about original sin, and I paraphrased him. He said, "The inquiry is not necessary, for all the laws of heaven and earth are unable to prevent men from their crimes." Now, Mr. Hitchens is very much in the position of someone watching a cripple walking painfully with 2 crutches, moving arduously, and saying to himself and saying to you, "I've got a great idea, kick one of the crutches away. Everything will be so much better." That seems to me a weak argument. A weak argument, not an impossible argument. I would welcome the defense of the argument. But it is no rebuttal to my position that atheism poisons everything, that religion poisons something. There are plenty of poisons in the world. We don't lack an abundance. Second point I would like to mention is this strange enchantment with the views of, say, Lawrence Krauss or Stephen Hawking. You know, Stephen Hawking just published a book, and I don't know whether any of you have yet seen it. It is, again, a book explaining how everything began, why it's there, why we shouldn't worry about God, and a multitude of other subjects. He published it in collaboration with a friend of mine, Leonard Mlodinow, and of course the lines are very deep in the bookstores. And to paraphrase the claim that he now makes, having given up A through N, he now champions something called M theory. The claim that he now makes is the universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory. The universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory. I don't deny what Stephen Hawking has said. I do not endorse it. I haven't read the book, although I've read his other books. I respect Hawking as a reputable physicist who did his great work 30 or 40 years ago. But I can tell you this, what is lamentably lacking in every one of these discussions is that coruscating spirit of skepticism which a Christopher Hitchens or a Richard Dawkins or a Vic Stengel will bring to religious claims, and that lapses absurdly when it comes to scientific claims. Surely we should have the sophistication to wonder at any asseveration of the form that the universe just blasted itself into existence following the laws of M theory, a theory that no one can understand, whose mathematical formalism hasn't been completed, and which has never once been tested in any laboratory on the face of the earth. Third and final point of rebuttal, the fact that the earth, our home, is a small part of the physical universe does not mean it is not the center of the universe. That is a non sequitur. After all, no one would argue, least of all Mr. Hitchens, that the doctrine that home is where the heart lies is rendered false by distance. We should be very careful about making these claims. I agree, the universe is very big, lots of galaxies, amazing things. And there is certainly some point of continuity between human beings and the animals that went before. But as for the central religious claim that this particular place is blessed and important, that's quite different. No doctrine about physical size rebuts it. Thanks very much.
How much? Yeah, I want them all. Yeah, I want. I swore to answer Professor Belinsky's 2 points about totalitarianism and atheism. Well, his 1 point, and I had one to make. Perhaps I'll make it in preface. Atheism by itself is, of course, not a moral position or a political one of any kind. It simply is the refusal to believe in a supernatural dimension or a supernatural supervisor or dictator. And it's the maintenance of the view that though that cannot be disproved, no good evidence has ever been adduced for it or any good argument put forward for it. But that's where it ends. You can be an atheist and a nihilist. You can be an atheist and a sadist. You can be an atheist and say, as is said in Dostoevsky's famous passage of Brothers Karamazov, without God, anything is possible, anything is doable, is thinkable. Of course, that's open, I would say, immediately to the objection that anyone who says they have God on their side also awards themselves, and you can see it happening by opening the newspaper, the right to commit any crime, however ghastly. That there's no escape from the existence of certain psychopathic human beings who either for want of supervision or by invoking the idea that they are the agents of a divine supervisor will do anything at all.